I'm very pleased to welcome back to the show a guest who's been with us many times before, Jared Beck. Welcome, Jared. How are you?
I'm doing well. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me, Jason.
It's great to see you, Jared. And, before we get into the conversation, there's been a major breaking news story I'm sure everybody's aware of and possibly even not watching us, but Donald Trump has become, is it the third president in the history of the country to be impeached? I think it's the
right.
third.
I mean, it would be Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Trump.
This
right?
feels like a very crooked impeachment to me, and I hope, Trump has already said that history will vindicate him. I think that's true. There's so much that we could talk about. It would be a separate show to just talk about the legality or illegality of the impeachment and all the proceedings. But we're going to talk today, Jared, about the order that came down in Emmett Sullivan's courtroom. Frankly, I was quite surprised. I thought that Sidney Powell had put together a really strong new set of defenses, basically excoriating the FBI for changing 302s. And when people watch this kind of thing on the news, it's very easy for non-lawyers, for lay people who, we're basically in the audience watching this. Everybody formulates their opinion, and then they have this very binary kind of black and white. This happens, and they immediately say Emmett Sullivan is a traitor and whatever. But, I'm not a lawyer, obviously. As I read the 92-page order that he put down on the 16th, the problem with it is, it seems like he's right on most of these things. What do you think?
Well, I think the first thing you have to understand when you look at orders like this, and I think you hit it right on the head, which is that you have to approach these orders with a certain level of understanding. You don't necessarily have to be a lawyer to understand what these orders signify, but you do have to be adept at reading between the lines. And not, going beneath the plain text of the order to get at the true meaning of what's being presented. And, this is a very, very interesting case. It's obviously going to be overshadowed by the impeachment that's going on. So, I don't think there's going to be a lot of really in-depth analysis out there.
Right.
And a lot of it, and the analysis that is out there is just going to be this binary back and forth, which doesn't really get into the details. But I think, it's great that you're having a show on this right now, because this case, I think, reveals a lot about the state of our political system. But you have to read between the lines to understand that, and you have to understand the entire context of this case. And I don't think a lot of people have really dug into that at that level. So this is good.
Most of the news is
just
sorry to interrupt, Jared. Most of the news is just selecting choice words to basically insult General Flynn and his lawyer, Sidney Powell. I don't think these accusations were dubious, but it's interesting to see how the New York Times and the Washington Post are reporting on this.
Right. So the first thing you have to understand or appreciate about this case is this is a classic instance of sort of this show trial litigation that's become very commonplace in America, which is really an instance of the deep state talking to itself through the litigation process. And what I mean by that is that you've got a judge, Emmett Sullivan, who's about as deep state as you can get. I mean, he's spent his whole career in D.C. He was originally appointed to the D.C. Superior Court by George H.W. Bush, and then he was appointed to the D.C. District Court by Bill Clinton, I believe. So he is about as enmeshed in the deep state as possible. And then you've got, the two sides that are actually litigating this case before him. On the one hand, you've got the FBI through the Department of Justice, which has put Flynn up on perjury charges, which he pled guilty to. Yeah. And then on the other hand, you have Flynn himself, who is also, a long-standing deep state operative, who, this is a guy who was a lieutenant general in the military. He was a registered Democrat. Yeah, so all three sides of this case are the deep state. Okay, so it's in a way it's the deep state talking to itself and presenting a picture of the reality of politics in America. And I think this case, this opinion by Sullivan that came out yesterday, is a direct response to the Horowitz report, the IG report that came out. And I think a lot of people, especially on the right, were pinning a lot of hopes on that report, which found just extraordinary irregularities in the FBI spying on the Trump campaign, basically. Yeah. And this order is basically sending a very loud and clear message, and this is my reading of it, and this is my understanding of the essence of this order, is that it's basically telling the country that there will be no consequences to all of the irregularities and, the horrible things that went on.
For the FBI, you mean, there'll be no consequences?
Correct. There will be no consequences.
But for Flynn, there will be consequences.
Correct. And Flynn is basically a scapegoat in all of this, in my opinion.
Right.
He's been sort of cast out there as the defendant in this legal proceeding, which at its basis is reveals a lot about how politics operates in this country. To me, the most extraordinary part of the Horowitz report was the finding that Trump's briefing sessions were actually infiltrated by FBI operatives in order to get a reading on Flynn's mannerisms, because they were setting him up to be the fall guy. That's a really extraordinary fact when you think about it. It shows just how ironclad the deep state's control over this country is.
Yeah. I think a lot of people haven't really delved into the Horowitz report. I'm frankly guilty of that. I haven't really fully absorbed the thing, but I was reading this order, this memorandum of opinion from Judge Emmett Sullivan more closely. And so just getting back to that, because the Horowitz thing is important and we should talk about it. It's an interesting angle that this is, sort of a distraction from that. And it's also interesting, Jared, because you remember General Flynn was the first sort of casualty in this war against Donald Trump. When he was in there as the national security advisor, you recall there was that whole thing where Mike Pence went on TV and Flynn had lied to Pence or something, and that caused them to fire him. So it really seemed like there was a complicated sequence of events set up there. But let's talk specifically about Sidney Powell's new approach, because Flynn was first represented by Covington and Burling. You want to talk about deep state. It doesn't get any deeper than the deep state of Covington and Burling. Eric Holder is a partner over there. This thing is a Clinton sinkhole, if there ever was one. Why would General Flynn select Covington and Burling as his attorney?
Well, you hit the nail right on the head. Why on earth, if you're facing a prosecution that is obviously politically motivated and has everything to do with the FBI spying on Trump, setting up the entire Russiagate narrative, which is bearing fruit today in the impeachment of Trump, the third impeachment in this country's history. Why on earth, if you're Flynn, do you choose Eric Holder's law firm to represent you? Number one. And number two, why does he just go out and plead guilty? Why doesn't he put up a fight right away? What's going on there? And to me, the fact that he was represented by Covington, that he allowed himself to be represented by Covington, suggests to me that he's not only a fall guy, but he was somehow complicit from the very beginning in this entire process.
Wow.
And he was, dangled and placed into the Trump campaign for the very purpose of undermining the Trump campaign.
Wow.
And I know there are a lot of people on the right that see Flynn as a sympathetic character who has made sacrifices for Trump. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that's the right conclusion to draw from this. I mean, I think that he was placed there. He was taking order. The fact that he hired Eric Holder's law firm to defend him in a case which is all about a politically motivated prosecution brought by Eric Holder's camp. I think it speaks for itself. I mean, that is not, the law firm that I would hire to put up a vigorous defense if I was having the screws put to me as was going on. So to me, that's an indication of something very, very significant.
Yeah, and we don't really know what the answer to that is. I did have opportunity to ask Michael Flynn's brother Joe why they had selected that law firm, and he said, it was just a mistake. He didn't really explain it. He didn't really know, and I don't feel that he was hiding anything from me. But you
Right.
think about Michael Flynn is obviously a military expert. He's spent 33 years in the military, so he knows a lot about that, and he was the head of the DIA. I'm sure he knows a lot about intelligence and counterintelligence and all that kind of stuff. But maybe he doesn't know that much about how to organize a legal defense. And it's a fair thing to consider. People are experts at what they're experts at, but they might not know that much about things that are outside of their field. This one seems kind of obvious, though.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's such a thing as a patsy, and
somebody
and you're
set
right.
him up, you mean, and sent him to Covington specifically to go there.
Sure, and he may be a half-willing patsy. He'll get pardoned by Trump.
You sure?
I
Trump's
believe.
in a pretty rough political situation himself right now.
Well, yeah, but he's not. I don't think there's a chance in hell he's going to get removed from office. I don't see that happening, and I believe that before Trump leaves office, he'll pardon Flynn. I think that's part of the deal here, and it's very reminiscent of Watergate, where certain people did jail time, and the narrative. The prevailing narrative about Watergate is that there were people doing Nixon's bidding, but I think in reality they were planted there by the deep state, the same deep state that's in control today. It was doing its thing during Watergate, and it was setting Nixon up. And, Nixon actually didn't want to go through impeachment. He stepped down before they could impeach him.
Well,
Trump,
he knew he was guilty, right?
Well, I don't know how guilty he was. I think he was set up in the same way that Trump was set up. I think that I believe that Watergate was as much a sham proceeding as Russiagate. I think there's a lot of parallels between the two. I think Nixon is something of a different character than Trump in the sense that Trump is going to go all the way to the mat on this, and he's not going to be removed. I think that Nixon was, from a different era, and at the end of the day, he didn't believe it would be in his interest to fight impeachment, and he stepped down.
Yeah. We should do a show about Watergate someday, because I don't think that that's a story that's been fully or properly told for the most part. But getting back to the Flynn matter, I think a lot of people right now are feeling like Judge Sullivan did something. I mean, you're saying, in your opinion, he's deep state. I don't know the guy. You're right. He's appointed by some extremely shady characters. And, this is not what I expected him to do. Michael Flynn, of course, is now represented by Sidney Powell. I have met and spoken with Sidney many times. I'm extremely impressed by her. She's obviously a very competent, very capable lawyer, and she came out swinging. She had what seemed like a good defense for the general. What did you think about Sidney Powell's approach, and where do you think it missed?
Well, I think the tactic that was taken by her, and the switch to actually instead of just pleading guilty, actually attacking the integrity of the prosecution itself, which could have been done from the very beginning, but Eric Holder's law firm didn't pursue that strategy. This is the essence of back to the Horowitz report. This is the essence of what it means to be ethical in the prosecution of somebody, the fact of the matter is that they were setting up Flynn from the very beginning, infiltrating the president's briefings, his national security briefings, in order to get a read on Flynn's body language so that they could get him into the perjury trap. I mean, that's all the case is about. It's a perjury trap, right? I mean, the charges against Flynn, and this is very, very important to understand, the charges against Flynn aren't Flynn conspired with the Russians, okay? Yeah. The charges against Flynn are that he lied to the FBI in the course of their Russiagate investigation, which, by the way, if you actually read the Mueller report, you'll know that, there was no Russian collusion, okay? And that's why the whole narrative shifted to the Ukraine and Hunter Biden, okay? And that's why we have this impeachment. So, it's like this incredible game of hopscotch. I mean, you go from one thing to another, completely unrelated. But if you go all the way back to the beginning, that's what they were setting up Flynn for, right? Yeah. Which was, tying him to the Russiagate investigation. And the charges are that he lied to the FBI and that he misstated he falsely represented what he had told the Russian ambassador in conversations with him. All right. And what's really interesting about that is that the FBI had been listening in on those conversations, so they already knew what he had said, right?
Yeah.
So all of this is like this crazy, he lied to the FBI about things that you already knew about because you were spying on the Trump campaign and infiltrating, what's more concerning, the perjury trap or the fact that the deep state has thoroughly infiltrated our government and we completely stripped, I believe, all branches of government from any true autonomy. And that's the really scary thing about all of this.
Absolutely. So there were a number of things in Emmett Sullivan's memorandum opinion that addressed what you're talking about. So I agree with what you've just said. And Sidney Powell, we heard on the news and from reading the pleadings, was attacking this various improprieties in the process of the FBI, changing of 302s, which are the reports on the interviews with Flynn. What can you say? I mean, Emmett Sullivan just flatly rejected all of this. This wasn't even, granted in part and denied in part. Everything was totally knocked out of the box. There was even a question about the ethical, what was the wording that was used? Something to do with the ethical concerns with Mr. Flynn's brief. The court notes that Mr. Flynn's brief in support of his first Brady motion lifted verbatim portions from a source without attribution. This is a scary thing for a lawyer to see in a judge's memorandum opinion, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the wildest part of this opinion, because lawyers pull things from briefs and complaints and documents all the time. There's nothing unethical about it. In fact, there's a term in plaintiff's class action law called a copycat complaint. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if a lawyer files a class action against a company, say in California, and another class action lawyer wants to file that same claim in New York, let's say, he or she will routinely copy verbatim the complaint from California and just change a few words. I mean, this happens all the time. It's called a copycat complaint, and there's nothing unethical about it. In fact, it's just part of the practice. And I found that passage from the judge in the Flynn case to be so bizarre, really? Especially since he says, all authorities must be cited. Well, this was just language taken out of an amicus brief, okay? Not an authority, but a brief. Briefs are copycatted all the time. I see it all. It's routine. So, to me, that, when you see a judge make a stretch like that, to me, it suggests that the judge has actually subconscious misgivings about the order that he or she is writing. In this case, this is a predetermined result. Okay, wow. Let's not fool ourselves into thinking that this judge had any other choice but to rule in the way he did, regardless of what the facts and the law say. Wow. And that's just the reality of our system. We live in a political patronage system that's run by the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And these judges, I'm not saying all judges, but the judges who are particularly tied to the machine, they know how to read between the lines very, very well, and they know how to get to the result that is politically expedient for them, without having to be told directly. Okay, so it's a predetermined result, and I believe that this order has all the hallmarks of a predetermined result against Flynn, and it doesn't matter how many improprieties were made in the course of the investigation against him. The fact that he was obviously given horrendous counsel by Covington, and that may or may not ultimately be another line of attack here, is that he was given extraordinary ineffective assistance of counsel. But at the end of the day, this is a political show trial in a deep state system, and that's what we're witnessing.
Wow. And so Judge Sullivan, that's such good insight, Jared, because I read that and I thought it was correct. When he says that a lawyer, I mean, when you say authorities, it's like if you're stating case law, then you have to quote it and all that. Exactly.
You have to. Authorities means something that would have a binding result as a matter of law. An amicus brief is just, it means nothing. It's just a brief that's filed not even by one of the parties, but by a friend of the court in another litigation. And this lawyer's brief actually had cited that brief in another portion of the brief, I believe. So to call that an ethical violation, that's just not only is it a low blow, but it's extraordinarily disingenuous, and it goes against the general practices in the legal system. Because, look, when you're in the legal system, you're not in the plagiarism game, okay? Right. You're in the trying to get at the facts. You're trying to get at the facts, and you're trying to get at the law, and you're trying to get to the right result. And attribution is secondary, and there's no right. You can't copyright the facts and the law, right? So if a brief contains the facts and the law, then if you want to cite from it, if you want to quote, if you want to copy the language into your own brief, then you're free to do so. I mean, it's probably better practice to attribute with quotation. And I haven't actually read her briefs, but I've read an account of her briefs which said that she had cited it in another portion of her brief. Mm-hmm. So it just seems like much ado about nothing. I've never seen that in an order before. In fact, and like I said, copycat complaints are commonplace. Yeah. Lawyers' writings are plagiarized all the time, and plagiarism isn't the correct word, okay, when you're dealing with the legal system, because there is no plagiarism.
Sure. And I don't know if you recall this, Jared, but when General Flynn appeared before Emmett Sullivan for the first time, it was like December something of 2018. Here it looks like maybe December 18th, 2018. Emmett Sullivan kind of spoke out of order a little bit. He was talking about how Michael Flynn had betrayed his country, and he said a couple things that were wrong, to the extent that when he came back from a brief recess, he actually apologized. But the problem is, the Washington Post and all of the Get Trump press seized on that and really highlighted the negative things that Emmett Sullivan had said. So it sounds like your analysis of this order indicates that for whatever reason, Emmett Sullivan is being compelled to rule against Flynn in basically every single way that he possibly can, even if it looks slightly awkward or unusual.
It's a political patronage system that we're dealing with in the federal courts. I mean, if he wants to move up in the chain of command, as a judge, you either go the red path or the blue path, right? And he's on the blue path, and the blue path clearly dictates that Michael Flynn needs to go to jail. Okay, so that's the nature of the decision here. Yeah. I think it's unfortunate. It's sad for the legal system, but it's the reality. I think people need to become comfortable with that reality, because I don't think it's going to change anytime soon, unfortunately.
Yeah. We've got some good comments coming in right now. Stefan is making a point of reminding us that Sidney Powell actually said that Emmett Sullivan was one of her heroes in her book, License to Lie. And that's got to be a tough blow for her to deal with, going into it thinking, hey, we've got a fair-minded judge here, and then something like this comes back. So, again, I'm reading this order and presuming that what the judge is saying is correct, but you're helping me to get perhaps a better understanding of it, and that's a very good reason for us to be doing this. So the next thing the judge talks about is that Mr. Flynn had misconstrued Brady and its progeny. What do you think about that?
Yeah, Brady is not something I'm an expert in. This is a doctrine of criminal law which applies to the disclosure of exculpatory evidence, and there seems to be a disagreement about whether evidence is exculpatory or inculpatory.
And just for people who aren't lawyers, exculpatory means it would serve to show that Flynn is innocent, and inculpatory, I guess, means shows that he's guilty.
Yeah, in a nutshell. Um, the bottom line here is, for me, is that uh, if we were in a system, not a political patronage legal system, but in a system that was closer to the rule of law, in a traditional sense, then what you would see is that you would have this Horowitz report come out. It would, it raises severe concerns about the conduct of an investigation, including uh, uh, two issues that pertain directly to the investigation of Flynn. And then you would have in the Flynn proceeding, the judge would stand up and say, look, the Department of Justice has taken a hard look at the FBI's practices. There are significant failures and irregularities. We can't have this infect our prosecution. And so I'm going to take a hard look at everything Flynn is putting forward through his new counsel, which now really has legs in light of what the Horowitz report has found. And I'm going to issue a ruling which creates the appropriate incentives for the prosecutors and the FBI to act in an ethical manner. Because let's bear in mind that the Horowitz report had absolutely zero consequences. Okay,
well, isn't it
absolutely zero.
Isn't it not yet? I mean, isn't there too soon to judge that? Can't they possibly? I mean, I agree with you that nothing's going to happen, but
No, I'm saying I meant to say as a legal document. It has absolutely. I'm not saying as down the road. I'm saying as a legal document, and it is a legal document. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's an official memorandum report from an inspector general, but it's not a judgment. Okay, it's not an order. It's not a legal document that carries consequences.
He's not the attorney general. He doesn't have any ability to actually try anybody or charge anybody. He's just like saying, hey, here's what I found.
Correct. He's not the attorney general, but he is presented to us as the, when there are internal problems in the Department of Justice, he's the guy that inspects those, right? Inspector General, right. And then issues a report. So he, as far as that issue is concerned, that domain, he's the number one guy. Okay, so he's not like some schmo off the street who's just kind of like, writing,
it's not an op-ed.
Garbage in a notepad.
Right, it's not an op-ed, but it's also not going to send anybody to jail.
He is the number one guy. So what he writes should be taken very, very seriously, right? So who are the people that can issue judgments? Well, judges are people who can issue judgments. Judge Sullivan is a judge, okay? So what he should be doing in a rule of law system is he should be taking that Horowitz report and making law out of it through a judgment. Instead of what he's doing is he's going out of his way to further the fruits of what I think Horowitz says is an unlawful prosecution.
Now, we had Larry Klayman on the other day, and Larry was talking about the possibility, Flynn pled guilty. And in that hearing where Sullivan kind of rudely said that he was a traitor, that didn't seem like a good thing for a judge to say. But he also asked Flynn, are you aware of what you're signing, and you're, all right with your lawyers and all that. So some people were speculating that because Flynn was so far down the road of having pled guilty and accepted this plea deal, that to just overturn it now is kind of upending the concept of plea bargaining. I know you're not a criminal attorney. I don't know if you've dealt with plea bargains in your career. What do you think about that statement from Larry?
There's a strong argument there. that a plea bargain is a plea bargain. You plead guilty, then you're represented by counsel. In this case, the most expensive counsel money can buy. Then you're stuck with your plea. You can't go back and change your mind, right? On the other hand, I think we have to look at this in the larger context. You're up against the deep state, okay? The deep state is wielding the culture against you. And now you yourself may be part of the deep state, but you have an extraordinary imbalance of power here because you're just one man, right? And you've been set up. Maybe the best way to get out of this is just to fall on your sword as soon as possible, and that's what you're being told. Is that the type of justice system that we really want to foster in this country? Because prosecutors are supposed to be bound by ethics that control their prosecution. In this case, we're led to a plea bargain that is the result of an investigation where the FBI was literally infiltrating Trump's national security briefings with agents in order to get a read on Flynn's body language so they could better catch him in the perjury trap when they went to interview him. I mean, this is very, very intense stuff. And it has, as far as a prosecution is concerned, it's extraordinary that we would be cool with something like that in our society. So for me, it seems to me that the only order that brings us to a system of rule of law in this country is one that seriously looks at the consequences of what Horowitz is saying and applies those to Flynn's prosecution. And maybe there has to be new law forged with respect to plea deals, but judges do that all the time. It just depends on what type of judge they are. And in certain cases, it depends on who their political patrons are.
Mm-hmm. And this 92-page order, obviously this is a big, complicated, important case. I haven't seen that many orders in my short amateur legal career, but none of them have been 92 pages. It seems like a pretty extensive order. I would imagine that the clerks and the judge were working on this. They didn't just write this the night before. Is the Horowitz report even something that they were considering when they were writing this?
Oh, sure. I think in many ways this is a direct response to the Horowitz report, which is it's a sad message which is being sent out, whether consciously or unconsciously by the judge. But the message is that we live in a deep state world, and there will be no consequences when the deep state is doing its thing, even when it's spying on a presidential campaign. Mm-hmm. So for all of you who think that the president is in charge of the executive branch of our government, think again. You're wrong.
Yeah.
That's what I see it as. I was gonna. God, there was something else that I was gonna mention. Never mind.
Sure. And, they go into a lot of really detailed description about the Brady laws and, the type of evidence that he's asking for. I mean, again, you watch Fox News or CNN and you get somebody's opinion based on something that somebody told them from somebody who read this. And that's going to be different than when you actually read it. And then now that I'm talking to you about it, some of the things that I presumed when I read it, I'm realizing, maybe I was just thinking this judge, everything he's writing here is correct, but it sounds like perhaps not. Some of the things they were talking about had to do with when you get down to the specificity of how these Brady rules work, and, you're dealing with the government, obviously, and there's certain things they're talking about, Rule 16 provides for pretrial disclosure, and now it's not pretrial, so that kind of stuff came into play. Were there other things in the order that you felt were just so bizarre or wrong or something you'd never seen before? Or did you feel like a lot of what Sullivan was saying was maybe unfortunate for Flynn, but unfortunately accurate to the law?
I wasn't. Again, I'm not a criminal lawyer, so a guy like Larry Klayman is probably better disposed to understanding the exact case law that undergirds Brady. The difference between inculpatory evidence and exculpatory evidence, the issue of timing, the issue of how much disclosure you're entitled to before there has been a prosecution. I mean, the issue that you're talking about, records of things you yourself said, these are all, you can, and Sullivan decided to, in fact, write essentially a treatise on a lot of these issues, which is all, I think, part of the show. He knows, I mean, he was the judge in the Ted Stevens case. I don't know if you recall that, but he was a senator from Alaska who was caught up in a very corrupt prosecution. And actually, he was quite favorable to Stevens. I believe he tossed the case, and so he understands the concept of a corrupt prosecution. I think the problem is that we're sort of dealing with something that is very, very central to the battle that the deep state is fighting right now,
right,
which is the Russia Gate narrative, which is sort of being, it's a very threadbare narrative that is sort of by a string holding up the deep state's legitimacy. I think a lot of people are waiting for that string to break, or they expect it to break. I'm not so certain it's going to break anytime soon, but it's very, very threadbare. So the people that are most invested in the deep state are, whether consciously or subconsciously, they're doing their most to advance the deep state interests. So I think that's kind of what's going on in this order. And it's sort of, the 92 pages is a tell. So that's a lot of ink to spill.
It's a long order, right?
Oh, it's an incredibly long order. I mean, by contrast, we had, in the DNC fraud case, we had, fairly substantial orders, but they were 35-page orders in actually less than that, I think, in the trial court.
Sometimes it's 2 pages, right? Sometimes the order is bing.
Sure. Yeah, there's no obligation to write a long order. That's another thing you have to keep in mind. When a judge writes a long order, a particularly long order, it's because there's a certain audience that the judge knows they have, so they're writing for that audience. If they believe that there's not a particular audience or not an important audience, then yeah, you're more likely to get like a 2-page order. That's, not everybody's treated equally in our justice system, believe it or not.
I do believe that. I've seen it happen. It's interesting that you brought up this Ted Stevens case. I think Larry has mentioned that in conversations we've had. And I also think that this is part of the reason why a lot of people expected this outcome to be more favorable for General Flynn, because in this case, Emmett Sullivan went to the rare, perhaps unprecedented step where he was actually he was trying to find out if a special prosecutor could investigate whether the government lawyers could themselves be prosecuted. So, I mean, this sort of seemed like the ideal judge for General Flynn, given the circumstances, and it still went south. Are you saying that you wouldn't be surprised if someone along the lines of, and I'm not saying specifically this person, but we've seen shockingly unethical conduct from people like Peter Strzok, and there's probably many of them in the CIA, the FBI, wherever they might be. They've got the ability to put pressure on judges and tell them this is where the order's going to go?
I don't think that the judicial system generally works like that. My view is that the judges who ascend to the federal bench these days are very, very astute at understanding where they need to go with their opinions, and they understand the mechanics of our government very, very well. While the public doesn't understand it at all, these are very, very political animals, these judges, and so they understand how to craft their orders appropriately. A lot of times the orders are written by clerks.
Right.
Some of the clerks, oftentimes, they have deep state connections. They come from deep state backgrounds. The message of the Horowitz report that we can't lose sight of is that the deep state has fully infiltrated our government, and that was particularly an examination of the executive branch, where the FBI had people infiltrating national security briefings to get a read on Flynn's body language. So that's the extent of the infiltration. But it's also infiltrated the judicial branch very extensively through various channels. Judges don't, it's these orders are often written by clerks. These clerks often have deep state connections.
And can the clerk influence the order? I mean, is the clerk sitting there having lunch with the judge saying, hey, Judge, probably should think about this?
I've had a case. I had a case in front of a judge once who never wrote their orders, and their clerk actually did all of their orders for them, and they never even wrote them. So,
what's the purpose of the judge then?
Well, what's the purpose of a congressperson? I mean, in theory, a congressperson is supposed to represent the will of the people in our legislative bodies. In practice, we've developed a system where they represent the interests of their donors and ultimately the deep state. The same thing has happened with the judge. I mean, the judge is sort of a figurehead for deep state interests that expresses itself in the judicial realm. I mean, I'm not saying all federal judges are like that, but I'm saying that that's the force that is exerted by the deep state itself, and that's how the judicial system is formed. And I'm not implying that anybody is personally culpable. I'm not implying that anyone isn't being a good judge. What I'm saying is that there are deep state forces that operate in the system that has developed over time. It's been in place for quite a while, and it explains these orders in a way that might not be legible to somebody that's coming at this from the perspective that we have the old style judicial system where the judicial branch was, it was independent.
Right.
I think that, and that's why a lot of our dialogue and our analysis is often confused and unsatisfactory. I think you pointed out this at the beginning of the show, right? That we get a very cramped understanding if all we do is tune in to CNN or Fox and we try to get a sense of these orders or these from sort of from that perspective, because those channels are meant to fool us into thinking we have a government that we don't actually have.
Right. And people are curious, Jared, what do you think is going to happen now? Is there going to be an appeal, or there's going to be a sentencing in January? Can Sidney Powell do anything to avert that? Can she try? Larry was speaking about the possibility of requesting to withdraw the plea and have a trial, but I mean, isn't this order basically Emmett Sullivan saying, look, a deal is a deal and you're going to get sentenced?
Yes. Yeah, I would say that he's going to get sentenced. Maybe we'll see an ineffective assistance of counsel defense. I mean, that would be that's where I would go with this if I were him. Yeah, I mean, I would say I was given horrible advice by these lawyers. I didn't know a lot of things. Sometimes that works, okay? I mean, you see a lot of cases that get reversed because of ineffective assistance of counsel. It's very often invoked in criminal proceedings. So I don't quite know how that works in the case of a plea deal. That would be an interesting question. Maybe Larry has some thoughts on that, but it'd be interesting to see that. Yeah, I think that I think he was given advice from Covington and Burling that that advanced interests that are not necessarily the interests of Mike Flynn, the person. At least that argument could be set forth.
Yeah, and obviously Sidney Powell's not going to tip her hand as to what she might do next, but I think a lot of people are waiting to see that.
Yeah.
A lot of people are also asking Jared about the changing of the 302 reports. I hadn't completed the full order before we began, but was there anything in there that addressed that, the FBI editing or changing 302 reports on Flynn interviews?
I can't recall if that was addressed directly. Let me see.
These are complicated documents to slog through. I mean, a lot of times certain things you read in them and it still doesn't even make any sense when you read it.
Yeah, I mean, it says on page 8 of the opinion that prior to Mr. Flynn signing plea agreement, the government on November 22nd, 2017 provided Mr. Flynn's attorneys with the FBI's FD-30-302.
Yep. And it summarized it. So I think this is the part where he's talking about they've met their obligations because some of the information has already been given to them. Some of it was not actually obligated to be given to them under the Brady. I mean, that's the thing. This is complicated stuff. And I try to do my best to understand these things rather than just, decide if I like Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow or Dan Bongino and go with whatever they say. I like to dig into it and get different opinions from you, different opinions from Larry Klayman. Obviously, this is not something that Sydney can talk about, and I haven't been bothering her while this case is going on. She needs to take it to places like Hannity and Mark Levin and get as much coverage as she can possibly get. But I think people are really confused by this. And now the questions are kind of going towards, what do you think about Barr and Durham? I don't want to get too far afield because any of these topics could be a whole entire show on their own. Fred Edward is telling us about John Kiriakou, who's been a guest on the show. He exposed the CIA torture program and was forced to take a plea deal, even though he was 100% innocent. I'm not directly familiar with John Kiriakou's case, but it's another one of these deep state things where, right along the lines of what you're saying, they basically have a predetermined outcome.
Yeah. I keep thinking of these, these people, there's this, I think there's still people that believe in Q and this whole idea of that there's going to be, a slew of sealed indictments unsealed and a great storm of justice. And they keep trying to talk about how, William Barr is going to lay down the boom. I really think people need to get comfortable with the reality of the system as opposed to what they hope the system can deliver. And I'm talking as an attorney that practices in this system. I've been doing it for a number of years. I don't do criminal cases, but do a lot of different types of civil cases, and nothing about this order surprises me. I mean, I've litigated against the deep state myself in the DNC case. I mean, the general rule is you don't win against the deep state in court. Okay, that's the one thing that I've learned as a lawyer in this system. You don't win against the deep state.
No matter what.
No, the deep state always wins, okay? And that's a good thing to know because I have to advise my clients accordingly, and I think it's an important basic thing that people need to understand. So when people talk about a great storm of justice coming and all these people going down, I would come back at them and say, you don't win against the deep state in court. That's a fundamental principle of the American legal system as it exists in 2019. This is another example of it, this order. And people who keep talking about how, Barr is going to lay down the boom and, Q is going to usher in a storm of justice. And indictments are going to be unsealed. They don't understand the American legal system as it exists. They're giving you a version of the American legal system as they hope it could be. And these are two different things. And I'm telling you practically, people will feel better and get about the situation the more familiar they become with reality, and the less they try to hope reality away. Yeah. So it's not good to get emotionally invested in people like Flynn. As I guess
you're going to be disappointed by the outcome. You mean.
Yeah, these heroes are. It's going to be a disappointment to you to feel that there's going to be justice done in any of these cases. The people who feel that Trump should be removed from office, all the Trump derangement syndrome people, they're going to be greatly disappointed when he's not removed from office. I can tell you that right now.
But that would be him winning against the deep state, wouldn't it?
No. I don't believe that at all, because I believe the deep state exists on both sides of the aisle. I believe that the red deep state is going to not remove him from office, because he's a Republican president who has presided over a very healthy stock market, and it would set a very, very bad precedent to allow the Democratic Party to drum up false narratives to get to nullify elections. So they're not going to.
This is just a way of smacking Trump on the nose with a newspaper and getting him to kind of comply with whatever.
Right. I mean, well, it's a way for the Democrats to control the narrative that distracts from the fact that they rigged the primaries against their own people in 2016. Right. So they got to keep that going. They don't give a shit about Trump anymore. I mean, they need to keep talking about how the elections were rigged and, by the Russians. And even though this has nothing to do with the Russians, now it's the Ukrainians and Trump, but most Americans can't tell the difference between Russia and Ukraine anyway, so it's good enough. I mean that in all seriousness.
No, you're right.
Though.
You're absolutely right.
It's good enough. So they keep that narrative, and even though this impeachment never in a million years is going to lead to his removal, they go through with it. And no, I don't believe it's Trump winning against the deep state. I believe it's ultimately the deep state. Trump is, very useful to the deep state. He's allowed the deep state to continue its work unabated in the background.
Saudi Arabian war in Yemen and things like this. Yeah.
I mean, there's been no
Jared,
execution.
let's do this real quickly, because we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to do a bit of a lightning round with you, because we've got some good questions coming, and there actually is one thing in this order that really did jump out at me. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so sometimes I'm missing things, and sometimes maybe I'm picking up things that somebody might breeze over. This is talking about how I'm here on like page 1, I think. In the introduction, they just give you the background about the FBI on January 24th, did blah, blah, blah. So on December 7th, 2017, this was originally presided over by Rudy Contreras. On January 24th, it was originally assigned to Contreras. He accepted the guilty plea. And then 6 days later, on December 7th, which is Pearl Harbor Day, it was randomly reassigned to Emmett Sullivan. Why would that be randomly reassigned, and is that random?
Well, we had an interesting, there was an interesting case in the Southern District of Florida where a lawyer down here who brought a lot of employment discrimination cases actually brought a formal complaint that the system was not random to assign cases, and that they were all going to a judge that was hated his guts and was giving him bad orders in all his cases. And he actually brought in a statistician to show that the assignments could not have come from a random process. And he ended up getting extraordinarily sanctioned by the court to the point where I believe he lost his law license or his ability to practice in federal court. I don't know if it went up to the Florida bar, but there was a scathing order. So this is obviously not the same jurisdiction. But I know that lawyers have challenged the randomness of the process in other cases. I mean, in this particular case, obviously that lawyer didn't have a very good result. In this case, now the suggestion is that on December 7th, the case was randomly reassigned to Sullivan, and there's a notion that wasn't a random reassignment.
I don't
that
know.
It was given to Sullivan.
It just jumped out at me that it said randomly reassigned. Like, why would they randomly reassign it? What was wrong? Why didn't they just follow
Well, I think
through
what they're saying, I think what they're saying is that that's the court's this internal procedure is that so Contreras accepted the guilty plea, and then I thought Contreras conflicted himself out or something.
Oh, maybe that's right.
Didn't he after accepting the plea, I seem to remember reading
but shouldn't
that
he do that kind of conflicting himself out before he hears the case?
I've had that happen to me. I've had multiple judges conflict themselves out after already hearing motions in the case. I mean, it's not unusual. Sometimes the circumstances change. It might have been. Sometimes it's from the. Here it is. Texts show judge who recused himself in case was friendly with FBI agent involved in probe.
Oh.
Okay. Yeah. So this is
before.
This is the Post. Well, maybe he didn't. Yeah, Rudy Contreras.
Stefan is telling us Contreras was a conflict of interest was struck.
Right. Okay. So, I guess it came to his attention that this was going to become an issue, and it did become an issue, and he decided that rather than take the heat for continuing to preside over a case where he had friendly witnesses with certain of the witnesses. Okay, he recused himself. I would say better late than never. And then the internal procedures of the D.C. court would say that the case needs to go to another judge.
So
well, how do you do that? You do
nothing wrong with that. Yeah, sounds.
Unless you believe that it wasn't randomly reassigned. I mean, I said that.
I didn't know all that stuff about him being conflicted. Now that you're telling me, I had heard it before, but when I was reading this morning, I wasn't thinking about that. The next thing I want to ask you in the lightning round here, Alexandra is saying that an Awan federal case is coming up. And I did hear something about, I don't remember if it was related to the Flynn case, but there was some reason why they couldn't release evidence because it's being used in some secret proceeding. We've got the people telling us that Awan took a plea agreement in exchange for what, and We the People presumes that Imran Awan is singing. I personally doubt that. I think Imran Awan is gone.
Yeah, I mean, wasn't this a FOIA request, and they came back and said they couldn't issue the FOIA. It was a
Judicial Watch FOIA request, right.
Judicial Watch. So they did a FOIA request, and the response was, we can't give you your requested documents related to the Imran Awan case because there's a confidential proceeding or investigation.
Right.
That could mean anything.
Probably working with Luke Rosiak, and they're looking for information. I don't think that's an indication that Imran Awan is testifying against anybody.
It could have to do with. It could be like an investigation of that bank fraud case that, he pled to. I mean, it could be something silly. Yeah. It means absolutely nothing.
Right.
Or they may consider, aren't they still investigating her laptop, the Capitol Police?
No, they gave it to Chris Gowan. Or did they? That was it.
Okay, that's it?
Yeah.
So I guess there were they felt there would be consequences, as she said, so they gave her back the laptop.
Yeah, I don't know. That whole case got totally screwed up. Well, Jared, I really appreciate you taking the time tonight. For people who haven't read your book, What Happened to Bernie Sanders, they can still get it from Goodreads and a variety of other bookstores, still available. You can get it on Kindle for Amazon, and if anybody is in the South Florida area and needs an attorney, they should contact Beck and Lee, trial lawyers. You guys have a wide range of areas of practice: personal injury, investor rights, consumer rights. Real estate has been a big area for you, antitrust, class actions, and whistleblower litigation. Unlike Mark Zaid, you guys aren't going to just take whistleblowers' money and deliver their information to the CIA, but that's what those guys seem to like to do, apparently.
Well, now we're very independent. I mean, I mean that's the approach we take to legal representation is our independence from the deep state, from corporations, from whomever, and increasingly in our legal system today, I think you find a dearth of lawyers that are truly independent and can offer very, very high quality, aggressive representation to people. I mean, look at Flynn. The first guys he hires are Covington, and to me it looks like they just sold the guy down the river.
Absolutely.
And he's a general, okay, but he's not a lawyer. He's going to defer to his lawyers,
right.
Legal counsel. It's very, very easy if they had him marked as a patsy, it would have been very, very easy to have him, fall into the trap. You do it through the very first lawyers he hires, and that's why independence of your counsel is very, very important. So when you get into a legal dispute, you have to make sure your lawyers are on your side, and the bigger firm that they work for. Firm like Covington, you can bet they're not on Mike Flynn's side. They're on the deep state side. Okay, they're Eric Holder's law firm. Yeah. So we don't do that, and we don't do the Mark Zaid practice either. I mean, that guy's a creep as far as I can tell. But
yeah, exactly.
he's got a whole. There's a whole industry that's going on, which is sucking on the deep state tit, and we don't do that down here. Exactly. We're very proud of our independence.
I appreciate that about you, Jared. Crowdsource The Truth is also independent. We rely on the sponsorship of the viewers, so if you've been watching us tonight, please visit patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth or subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth and become a sponsor. Jared, thanks very much. It's always great to speak to you. I think people really appreciate what you've been sharing with us tonight. Say hello to Elizabeth, and I will see you soon. Have a happy holiday, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year. We'll see you real soon, and thanks everybody for watching. Have a great night.
Okay, thank you.